My name is Jasmine, and yesterday my husband sent me a text message from a tropical beach. It read, "I ran away with your best friend, and we are never coming back." Most wives would fall to the floor weeping. Most wives would scream. I simply replied, "Good luck." I canceled every shared credit card, revoked his account access, and changed every digital lock on our smart home. I thought I was taking control. But the next morning, when federal agents kicked down my front door, I realized my husband had set a trap to bury me alive. I am 33 years old, and for the last 5 years, I thought I was building a solid, predictable life with Connor. He was a junior executive at a high-profile venture capital firm in Seattle, always chasing the next big deal. I ran a boutique data privacy and information technology compliance firm right out of our home. Connor believed my job consisted of resetting passwords and fixing printers. He had absolutely no idea what a senior cybersecurity auditor actually does on a daily basis, and that arrogant ignorance was about to become his ultimate downfall. The text had arrived at exactly 4 in the morning. The glowing screen of my phone cut through the heavy darkness of our bedroom. Waking up alone was completely normal for me. Connor had claimed he had an early morning flight to San Francisco for a sudden merger meeting. He kissed my forehead at 3, grabbed his leather bag, and walked out the door. An hour later, the message chimed. I read the words, letting them slowly sink into my brain. Ashley was my real estate agent and my most trusted friend. She had helped us buy this very house. She drank wine on my couch every Friday night. The sheer audacity of the double betrayal washed over me, but I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream into my pillow. An icy calm settled deeply into my bones. My professional instincts, honed by years of managing severe corporate crisis protocols, took over immediately. I got out of bed, walked straight into my home office, and sat down at my multi-monitor workstation. I initiated a complete digital lockdown. I secured my business servers, locked down our joint bank accounts, and wiped his access to my personal network within minutes. I ensured that when Connor and Ashley woke up in their tropical paradise, they would find themselves entirely cut off from my financial resources. I brewed a strong pot of black coffee and waited for the sun to rise, expecting angry phone calls from his blocked numbers. I felt incredibly empowered, believing I had successfully neutralized the threat. I was fully prepared to call a divorce lawyer at 9 o'clock and begin the clinical process of removing him from my life. I was drinking my second cup of coffee at 6 in the morning when the intense pounding started. It was not a polite knock. It was the aggressive, heavy hammering of fists against solid wood. I walked to the entryway, peering through the frosted side glass of the front door. I fully expected to see a delivery driver or a confused neighbor needing help. Instead, I saw dark tactical vests and gold shields glinting in the early morning light. I slowly opened the door. 4 armed officers crowded my front porch, their expressions grim and unyielding. A tall man with sharp eyes stepped forward, flashing his credentials. He introduced himself as Detective Ramirez. I immediately assumed they were here to tell me Connor had been in a terrible accident on his way to the airport. I prepared my face for a mask of polite shock, but Detective Ramirez did not offer any comfort or condolences. He stepped heavily into my foyer, his hand resting near his duty belt, looking at me with evaluating suspicion. He asked me to confirm my identity. When I did, he signaled to the other agents behind him. They filed into my home, their heavy boots tracking damp dirt across the hardwood floors I had painstakingly cleaned just the day before. I asked Detective Ramirez what was going on, keeping my voice carefully steady. I told him my husband had left the state just a few hours ago, suggesting they might have the wrong house. The detective pulled a thick, folded document from his jacket pocket. He informed me that they were not looking for Connor. They were looking for me. The document was a federal arrest warrant. I stood perfectly still, my coffee mug rapidly cooling in my hand, as the detective began to explain the severe charges. Connor's venture capital firm had initiated an emergency corporate lockdown at midnight. Their internal financial investigation team discovered a massive catastrophic breach. $8 million of highly sensitive investor funds had been siphoned from their primary holding accounts and routed through a complex, untraceable web of offshore shell companies. The theft was precise, executed with high-level administrative overrides that left almost no trail. It was a digital heist that would normally take a sophisticated team of hackers weeks to coordinate. But the financial investigators had traced the digital footprints back to a single, undeniable source. Ramirez looked me dead in the eye and delivered the devastating blow. The intrusion did not originate from a foreign country or a shadowy hacker syndicate. The entire $8 million transfer was executed using my personal residential internet protocol address. Furthermore, the security credentials used to bypass the firewalls belonged directly to my information technology compliance business. The air in my living room suddenly felt dangerously thin. Connor didn't just abandon me for a new life with Ashley. He needed a massive way to fund that luxurious life, and he needed a perfect scapegoat to take the fall. He had watched me work from home for years. He had carefully noted my daily routines, my security software protocols, and my secure connection to his firm's network, which I occasionally audited as a third-party contractor. He used his physical access to my home office to plant a backdoor into my servers. He orchestrated the massive theft, perfectly framed my business, and hopped on a plane. He wanted me locked in a concrete cell for a decade, while he sipped expensive cocktails on a white sand beach, laughing at how easily he had outsmarted his tech support wife. Detective Ramirez watched my face, waiting for the inevitable emotional breakdown. He expected tears, panicked denials, or a sudden demand for a defense lawyer. The other federal agents were already moving aggressively toward my home office, pulling out evidence bags to seize my computer equipment. Detective Ramirez pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic clink echoed sharply in the quiet foyer. He informed me I was being taken into custody for grand larceny and wire fraud. He advised me to put my coffee down and turn around with my hands placed behind my back. I looked down at the heavy steel handcuffs. Then I looked down the hallway at the agents preparing to unplug my main server tower. If they yanked those power cables now, the hidden failsafes I had built into my network would trigger a hard wipe, destroying the very evidence I desperately needed to save my life. I did not raise my voice. I did not beg for mercy. I took a slow, measured sip of my coffee, set the ceramic mug down on the entry table, and met the detective's hard stare. I calmly asked him to wait exactly 2 minutes while I booted up my encrypted server, promising to hand him the real thief. Detective Ramirez narrowed his dark eyes, studying my face for any sign of deception. The heavy silence in my foyer stretched out, broken only by the static hiss of a police radio. He glanced back at the armed federal agent standing in my hallway, then looked down at the steel handcuffs in his hands. He told me I had exactly 120 seconds to prove I was not a flight risk or a corporate criminal, warning me that if I touched a single wrong key, his agents would physically remove me from the premises. I simply nodded, turned around, and walked slowly toward my home office. I was acutely aware of the heavy tactical boots trailing right behind me, tracking damp morning dirt across the hardwood floors I had painstakingly cleaned just the day before. My home office was not the casual, messy space Connor always joked about to his friends. It was a sterile, climate-controlled room dominated by a custom-built server rack and 3 ultra-wide monitors. Connor used to laugh at my setup during our dinner parties. He would stand in our kitchen sipping his expensive scotch and tell his wealthy venture capitalist buddies that his wife ran an over-glorified information technology help desk. He loved to paint me as someone who spent her days resetting passwords and installing basic antivirus software for small local businesses. He completely underestimated me. I am a senior cybersecurity auditor. I spend my days dismantling complex financial data breaches and securing enterprise-level networks against sophisticated intrusions. He thought I was blind to his actions. He had no idea I was the one who designed the blindfold. I sat down in my ergonomic chair. Detective Ramirez stood directly over my shoulder, his hand hovering near his utility belt. I did not touch the mouse right away. I entered a complex sequence of keyboard shortcuts to bypass the decoy operating system Connor thought I used. The screens flickered from a standard scenic desktop background to a stark command line interface. I heard one of the younger federal agents behind me shift his weight, suddenly recognizing that they were not dealing with a standard civilian computer setup. I typed in my decryption keys, accessing a deeply buried partition on my network. This was my shadow log. I installed it 8 months ago. I did not do it because I suspected Connor of stealing $8 million from his firm. I did it because I noticed a sudden, unexplained shift in our household finances and his behavior. Connor had started staying up late, claiming he was reviewing overseas market trends for his investors. But I noticed small anomalies in our bank statements, unexplained cash withdrawals, and encrypted messaging applications running on his personal phone when connected to our network. Instead of crying, throwing a fit, or confronting him with baseless accusations that he would simply deny I did what I do best, I audited him. I silently turned our entire home network into a digital fortress of surveillance, logging every single packet of data that entered or exited this house. I opened the specific traffic logs from the previous night and dragged the window to the center monitor so Detective Ramirez could see it clearly. I asked him to verify the exact timestamps of the fraudulent $8 million transfers. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his police instincts warring with his curiosity, before reading off a sequence of times. The theft started precisely at 1 in the morning and ended at 2:15. I filtered my shadow log to that exact 90-minute window. The screen populated with lines of bright green data against the black background. I pointed to the screen, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. I showed the detective that yes, my administrative credentials were used to bypass the venture capital firm's security protocols. However, I highlighted the connection source. The session was not initiated locally from my keyboard. It was executed through a remote desktop protocol. Someone had remotely hijacked my terminal to make it look like the commands were coming from my physical location. Ramirez leaned in closer, his eyes scanning the raw data. He was a seasoned investigator, and he immediately grasped the implications of the remote login. He asked me where the external connection originated. This was the exact moment Connor's entire master plan crumbled into dust. I ran a trace routing protocol on the origin Internet Protocol address. It took less than 10 seconds for the geographical data to populate on a digital map on my third monitor. A bright red pinpoint dropped squarely onto a high-rise luxury condominium building in the center of downtown Seattle. I did not just give Ramirez the street address. I gave him the exact unit number. It was Penthouse 4. I turned my chair slightly, looking up at the detective, and informed him that this address belonged to Ashley, a high-end real estate agent who also happened to be my former best friend. The same woman who sat on my living room couch drinking wine with me just last week, while secretly plotting to destroy my life. To eliminate any remaining doubt, I pulled the hardware identification address of the specific laptop used to initiate the remote connection. I cross-referenced it with our home network history, proving the device was registered under Connor's personal cellular data plan. Connor had sat in his mistress's expensive apartment, drank her wine, and used his own laptop to remotely access my servers, framing me for a federal crime, while they packed their bags for a one-way trip to Cancun. The heavy, suffocating tension in my home office evaporated instantly. The younger federal agent cursed under his breath, stepping quickly away from my server rack as if it were a live bomb. Detective Ramirez stared at the screen for a long, quiet moment. He reached down to his belt and completely secured the heavy steel handcuffs back into their leather pouch. He did not apologize for almost arresting me, but his entire demeanor shifted from aggressive accusation to sharp, focused calculation. He realized he was no longer looking at a suspect, but a highly competent victim who had just handed him a closed case on a silver platter. Ramirez immediately grabbed his radio, stepping out into my hallway. I listened as he contacted his dispatch, urgently requesting a direct line to the Federal Bureau's Cyber Division. He explicitly ordered an international freeze on Connor's passport and requested immediate coordination with Mexican authorities. My husband was no longer a missing person or a clever thief. He was a fleeing federal fugitive who had just severely underestimated the reach of the United States government. The agents began packing up their unneeded evidence bags. Ramirez returned to the office and instructed me to export the shadow logs to a secure flash drive for their forensics team. He warned me that I would still need to come down to the precinct to give a formal recorded statement later today. I nodded calmly, initiating the file transfer while the agents finished their work. As the police concluded their business and began filtering out of my front door, I stood on my porch and watched the squad cars pull away from my curb. The morning air was crisp and cold, biting at my lungs. I took a deep breath, ready to finally process the reality of my newly shattered marriage and the fact that I was now entirely alone. But the quiet moment of reflection was violently interrupted. The heavy grinding roar of a diesel engine echoed down the quiet suburban street. A massive commercial moving truck turned sharply and aggressively back directly into my driveway, its reverse alarms blaring loudly. The reverse alarms pierced the quiet morning air, drowning out the gentle sounds of the suburban neighborhood waking up. I stood on my front porch, wrapping my cardigan tighter around my shoulders to ward off the chill, and watched two burly men in matching gray uniforms jump out of the cab of the moving truck. Before they could even unlatch the heavy metal loading ramp, a sleek white Mercedes sport utility vehicle pulled up right behind them, effectively blocking the public sidewalk. I recognized the vehicle immediately. It belonged to my mother-in-law, Linda. The passenger door swung open first, and my sister-in-law, Caitlin, stepped out wearing oversized designer sunglasses and holding a large iced coffee. Linda emerged from the driver's side moments later, a thick manila folder clutched tightly in her hand. They did not look like concerned family members arriving to offer support during a catastrophic crisis. They looked like hungry vultures circling a fresh kill, eager to pick my life apart. I remained perfectly still on my porch as they marched up the concrete walkway, their heels clicking aggressively against the pavement. Linda did not offer a greeting. She did not ask how I was holding up after finding out her son had drained his venture capital firm's accounts and fled the country with my best friend. Instead, she pushed right past me without a word, throwing her weight into my front door to force it open wider. Caitlin followed close behind, ignoring me completely as she instructed the two movers to start with the antique furniture in the formal living room. I stepped back inside my own home, firmly closing the door behind the moving crew. The air in my foyer suddenly felt thick and suffocating. I crossed my arms and calmly asked Linda exactly what she thought she was doing barging into my house with a commercial moving team at 7 in the morning. Linda spun around in the center of my foyer, her face twisted into a mask of pure, undisguised contempt. She held up the manila folder and slapped it hard against the surface of my entryway console table. She proudly declared that Connor had called her from an international airport terminal just a few hours ago. He had apparently warned his mother that I was about to be arrested by federal agents for orchestrating a massive corporate theft. She announced with supreme arrogance that she possessed a legally binding power of attorney, granting her absolute control over all of Connor's financial assets and personal property. According to her twisted logic, she was stepping in to seize all the valuable property inside the house before the federal government could freeze the marital estate and auction it off. She spoke with a level of smug satisfaction that made my stomach turn. Caitlin leaned against the wall, sipping her coffee, and casually added that they were going to start by taking the vintage leather sofas, the imported dining table, and all the electronics. I watched the two men carry flattened cardboard boxes and rolls of bubble wrap into my living room, acting as if I had already been convicted by a judge and sent away to a concrete prison cell. I told Linda to instruct her men to put their supplies down immediately. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed up into the high vaulted ceilings of my house. She told me I had absolutely no authority here anymore. Then, standing in the home I had meticulously maintained for 5 years, she began to verbally dismantle our entire marriage, revealing exactly how she had viewed me since the day Connor proposed. Linda paced across my polished hardwood floors, looking at my belongings with undisguised greed. She explicitly stated that she always knew I was a terrible match for her son. She called me tragically boring, a lifeless homebody who spent far too much time staring at glowing computer screens instead of attending society dinners and high-profile charity galas. She said Connor was a high roller, a brilliant financial genius who needed a dynamic woman who truly understood his elevated social status. She actually smiled a cruel, triumphant smile when she brought up Ashley. She praised my former best friend, calling her vibrant, ambitious, and perfectly suited for a man of Connor's caliber. Linda proudly admitted she had known about the affair for over 6 months. She had even encouraged it. She claimed Ashley knew how to treat a successful man unlike me, who only dragged him down with my rigid rules and my obsessive focus on data privacy compliance. Caitlin chimed in laughing as she recounted how Connor used to complain to them that coming home to me felt like walking into a corporate compliance seminar. They stood in my foyer, openly celebrating the destruction of my marriage and praising the very woman who had helped my husband frame me for a devastating federal crime. They genuinely believed Connor was the innocent victim of my malicious computer hacking. I let their insults wash over me without reacting. I did not raise my voice and I did not shed a single tear. I simply watched them expose the deep systemic family bias that I had quietly endured for years. I had spent countless holidays biting my tongue while Linda made passive-aggressive comments about my professional wardrobe. I had hosted dozens of family dinners where Caitlin treated me like a catering servant rather than a sister-in-law. Now the polite masks were completely gone. The movers began wrapping my expensive dining chairs in thick blue moving blankets. I stepped forward and firmly instructed the men to stop touching my things. Linda aggressively stepped into my path, cutting me off. She pointed her manicured finger directly at my face, her voice rising to a shrill, commanding pitch. She announced that they were taking everything of value, selling it immediately, and using the funds to hire Connor, a top-tier defense attorney, to fight the false charges I had fabricated. She then declared they were going to change all the exterior locks and alter the deed to the house before I was hauled off to federal prison later today. She commanded the movers to head upstairs to the master suite to pack up Connor's luxury watch collection and the entire contents of our personal safe. The master suite was my sanctuary, and the safe contained the exact legal documents that proved my absolute ownership of this property. I moved faster than Linda could anticipate. I walked briskly past her and positioned myself squarely on the third step of the grand staircase, physically blocking the path to the second floor. The two burly movers stopped at the base of the stairs, looking uncertainly from me to Linda. They were hired to move furniture, not to engage in a physical altercation with a homeowner. I looked down at the men and calmly informed them that if they took one more step up my staircase, I would press charges against them for breaking and entering, attempted theft, and trespassing. Linda's face turned a deep mottled shade of crimson. She ordered the men to push past me, waving the generic power of attorney document in the air as if it were an impenetrable shield against the law. When the movers refused to move, Caitlin immediately pulled out her expensive cell phone to call the sheriff to have me forcibly removed from Connor's private residential property. Caitlin lowered her phone with a triumphant smirk, crossing her arms over her chest as she leaned against the pristine white wall of my foyer. She proudly announced that the county sheriff was already on his way, assuring her mother that it would only take a few minutes for the authorities to drag me out of the house in handcuffs. Linda nodded in firm agreement, smoothing down the front of her expensive silk blouse. She glared up at me where I stood on the third step of the staircase, telling me that I had finally pushed my luck too far. She claimed I was about to learn a very harsh lesson about what happens when a nobody tries to steal from a family of their social standing. The two movers stood awkwardly near the front door, shifting their weight from side to side, clearly regretting taking this early morning job. They kept their hands entirely off my furniture, choosing to stare at the floor, while the two women continued to hurl insults at me. I did not respond to a single taunt. I simply stood my ground on the staircase, watching them perform their misguided victory lap in the center of my home. I knew exactly which documents I needed to produce, and exactly how I was going to systematically dismantle their arrogant assumptions. The heavy silence was broken by the sharp wail of a police siren approaching rapidly down the suburban street. A heavy sport utility vehicle marked with the County Sheriff Department logo pulled up right behind Linda's white Mercedes. A tall, broad-shouldered sheriff deputy stepped out of the vehicle and walked briskly up my driveway. Linda immediately rushed to the front door, throwing it open to greet him before he could even ring the bell. She launched into a frantic, highly dramatized performance. She waved her generic power of attorney document in the deputy's face, loudly declaring that I was a criminal squatter who was actively trying to steal her son's valuable property. She pointed an accusing finger at me, demanding that the deputy arrest me for trespassing and forcefully remove me so her hired moving crew could secure her son's assets. Caitlin stood right beside her mother, nodding vigorously, and adding that I was currently under federal investigation for corporate fraud. The deputy stepped into the foyer holding up a large calloused hand to stop the barrage of screaming. He possessed a calm, authoritative demeanor that instantly commanded the room. He looked at Linda, then at the movers, and finally up at me standing quietly on the stairs. He asked who officially owned the residence. Linda immediately shouted that the house belonged to her son Connor, and that she possessed the absolute legal authority to act on his behalf. She practically shoved the power of attorney paperwork into the deputy's chest. I slowly descended the 3 stairs, my posture relaxed and unbothered. I politely asked the deputy if he would mind stepping into my home office for a brief moment to review the actual legal documentation regarding the property. Linda scoffed loudly, warning the deputy that I was a manipulative liar who would try to show him forged digital records. I ignored her completely. The deputy nodded, following me down the short hallway into my sterile, climate-controlled office. Linda and Caitlin trailed right behind us, hovering aggressively in the doorway to ensure I did not try any tricks. I walked directly to the heavy steel safe, hidden behind a discreet wooden panel in the corner of my office. I entered the numeric code, opened the heavy door, and pulled out a thick embossed leather binder. I did not print out a digital copy. I handed the deputy the original notarized property deed complete with the raised county seals and the official closing signatures. I also handed him a certified stack of banking records that detailed the entire financial history of the property acquisition. The deputy opened the binder and began to read the documents. I turned to face my mother-in-law and sister-in-law. I kept my voice incredibly level as I shattered the grand illusion they had worshipped for years. I informed them that Connor's lavish high-roller lifestyle was an absolute facade. He was not a financial genius. He was a reckless liability who had secretly buried himself in massive amounts of debt. I revealed that 3 years ago Connor had quietly filed for total bankruptcy to avoid a complete financial collapse. He had no savings, no assets, and a completely ruined credit score. Linda's mouth dropped open. She tried to interrupt, loudly denying my claims, insisting her son was an executive making millions. I calmly spoke over her protests. I explained that to save us from literally living on the street, I had used my own corporate income to purchase this house. However, I was not foolish enough to attach a bankrupt man to my greatest asset. I bought the house entirely in cash, under a blind limited liability company called Apex Secure Holdings. I handed the deputy the corporate registration paperwork, proving that I was the sole founder, owner, and director of that specific company. I looked Linda dead in the eyes and delivered the final crushing blow. I told her that Connor's name was never printed on the title, the mortgage, or the property tax records. He did not own a single square inch of the hardwood floors she was currently standing on. Therefore, the generic power of attorney she was frantically waving around was completely and entirely useless. She had the legal authority to manage Connor's assets, but Connor had 0 assets to manage. The deputy closed the leather binder and handed it respectfully back to me. He turned to face Linda, his expression hardening into stern authority. He informed her that the documentation was absolute and irrefutable. I was the sole legal owner of the property. He told Linda and Caitlin that they had no right to be inside my home or to remove any items from the premises. In fact, he explicitly stated that they were the ones committing criminal trespassing. Caitlin stared at the deputy in complete shock, her iced coffee shaking in her hand. Linda began to stammer, looking down at her useless piece of paper as if it had betrayed her. She tried to argue that Connor's clothes and watches were upstairs claiming marital property rights. The deputy shut her down immediately, stating that taking anything by force would be considered burglary. He promised to arrest her on the spot. I walked to the foyer where the movers were waiting. I opened a cash envelope from my safe and pulled out 5 $100 bills. I offered the money with one instruction: take the boxes Linda packed, carry them outside, and dump them on my lawn. The lead mover smiled, took the cash, and grabbed the boxes. He marched out the front door and tipped them over. My coffee maker and books tumbled onto the grass. The deputy pointed toward the open front door, formally ordering Linda and Caitlin to leave immediately. She slowly backed out of my foyer, looking old and completely defeated. But just as she stumbled down the concrete step, her cell phone rang loudly from her designer handbag. She panicked and accidentally hit the speakerphone button while answering. It was Connor calling from Cancun. He was not sipping margaritas. He was screaming in a blind panic. His voice echoed off the high ceilings of my foyer, harsh and distorted through the tiny speaker of Linda's dropped cell phone. He was begging his mother to contact his wealth management firm, to call his private banker to get a hold of anyone who could fix what he called a catastrophic banking error. Linda stood frozen on my front porch, her eyes wide with terror, completely ignoring the sheriff deputy who was still pointing toward the street. I did not move to pick up the phone. I simply stood there and listened as my husband's perfect tropical fantasy violently unraveled in real time. Connor sounded completely unhinged. He shouted that he and Ashley had just arrived at a 5-star luxury resort on the coast. He had strutted up to the VIP reception desk, demanding the presidential suite with ocean views. To celebrate their new life together, he had taken Ashley into a high-end jewelry boutique located right inside the resort lobby. He wanted to buy her a $15,000 gold watch as a testament to his immense wealth. But when he handed his sleek, heavy metal credit card to the cashier, the transaction was immediately denied. He told his mother that he assumed it was just a temporary international security hold. He confidently pulled out his second card, then a third, and finally his corporate expense account card. Every single piece of plastic was aggressively declined. The boutique manager had asked them to leave, and the resort concierge politely informed him that they could not issue room keys without a valid payment method on file. I could hear the absolute humiliation in his voice. Connor was a man whose entire identity was built on the projection of limitless wealth and untouchable status. Being treated like a common fraudster in front of a lobby full of wealthy vacationers, and more importantly, in front of the woman he had just ruined his marriage for, was his ultimate nightmare. He practically sobbed into the phone, telling his mother that Ashley had been humiliated. She had stormed out of the boutique and demanded that he fix the problem immediately. That was when Connor made his fatal mistake. He admitted to his mother, completely unaware that a county sheriff and his discarded wife were listening to every single word that he had pulled out his laptop right there in the resort lobby. He connected to the public wireless network and attempted to manually wire funds directly from the offshore account he had set up. He needed cash immediately to save face and secure the luxury suite. But when he bypassed the security protocols and loaded the offshore dashboard, the account balance stared back at him in bold, unrelenting numbers: $0 and 0 cents. He screamed at Linda, demanding to know how an account holding $8 million could simply vanish into thin air. He asked if the venture capital firm had somehow managed to freeze the offshore routing numbers, pleading with her to use the power of attorney to transfer cash from my personal accounts. He had absolutely no idea that the power of attorney was worthless, and he had no idea that his firm was not the entity responsible for seizing his stolen funds. I stood in my foyer listening to Connor unravel through the speakerphone and understood exactly why every card and transfer had failed. The money had not vanished because of a routine banking error, and it had not been quietly reclaimed by his employer. The moment the $8 million transfer crossed my network, The automated compliance safeguards built into my servers identified an unauthorized movement of restricted funds. The transaction was immediately suspended, isolated from its destination, and reported through a secure federal channel connected to my firm's auditing systems. Connor had believed he was using my equipment as camouflage. In reality, he had triggered the same controls I installed to protect clients from catastrophic internal fraud. His offshore dashboard showed a zero balance because the money was no longer accessible to him, to Ashley, or to anyone at the venture capital firm. It was being held beyond the reach of ordinary commercial banking, while investigators determined exactly where it had come from and who had attempted to move it. I did not yet know how far the consequences would spread, and I was not prepared to discuss the details in front of Linda Caitlin or the sheriff deputy. What mattered in that moment was simple. Connor had no stolen fortune, no usable credit, no hotel room, and no legal authority over my accounts. The luxurious escape he had promised Ashley had collapsed before it truly began. Through the speaker, I heard him pacing across the resort lobby demanding answers from people who could not help him. He kept insisting that someone must have made a mistake, but the only mistake was his belief that my network was a passive tool he could exploit without resistance. He had spent years dismissing my profession as glorified technical support. Now the systems he mocked had quietly stripped away every dollar he planned to use against me. A second later, the rhythm of the call changed as someone approached him across the marble lobby. Through the speakerphone, the chaotic background noise of the Mexican resort lobby provided a vivid soundtrack to his absolute destruction. I heard the sharp, unmistakable sound of high heels clicking rapidly against marble floors. Then Ashley's voice cut through the audio, loud and vicious. She was not playing the role of the loving, supportive new partner. She sounded furious, her voice dripping with the exact same venom Linda had used against me just minutes prior. I listened as Ashley realized the full terrifying scope of their situation. She recognized that Connor was not a financial genius who had just secured their early retirement. He was a broke, legally radioactive fugitive whose credit cards were frozen and whose stolen millions had vanished. The illusion of the high-roller lifestyle instantly evaporated, leaving nothing but a desperate man begging a hotel clerk for a room. Connor pleaded with her over the phone. I heard him beg Ashley to just calm down and wait for him to figure it out. He promised her that his mother would wire them money, that he would call his partners, that it was all just a temporary misunderstanding. But Ashley was a real estate agent who dealt with high-net-worth clients every single day. She knew exactly what a total financial collapse looked like, and she knew that sticking around a frozen bank account meant she would inevitably be dragged down into the criminal conspiracy. She yelled at him, her voice echoing through Linda's dropped phone. She told Connor that he was pathetic, a complete failure who could not even pull off a simple wire transfer without ruining everything. She explicitly stated that she was not going to spend the best years of her life visiting him in a federal penitentiary. I heard the sounds of a physical scuffle, the rustling of fabric, and Connor's sudden sharp intake of breath. He screamed into the phone, telling his mother that Ashley was actually packing her bags right in the middle of the lobby. He sounded like a terrified child. Then the ultimate consequence of his betrayal played out live for all of us to hear. Ashley demanded his wallet. Connor tried to protest, but the sound of a zipper being aggressively pulled open told me she had simply snatched it from his hands. Connor wailed into the receiver, his voice cracking with genuine panic. He told Linda that Ashley had just taken his last $300 in physical cash. She was leaving him standing alone in the resort lobby with nothing but his useless plastic cards and a flagged passport. She abandoned the man who had destroyed his marriage for her, stealing his last bit of currency to buy herself a cheap, anonymous bus ticket straight to the border. The line went dead, leaving my foyer wrapped in a heavy, ringing silence as Linda stared down at the dark phone. Linda's hand trembled violently as she slowly lowered the silent cell phone. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her perfectly applied makeup looking like a brittle mask over pale, aging skin. Caitlin stood frozen against the wall, her oversized sunglasses slipping down the bridge of her nose. Neither of them said a single word. The reality of Connor's absolute destruction had finally penetrated their arrogant delusions. I did not offer them a glass of water. I did not offer them a tissue. I simply stepped aside, gesturing toward the open front door with a sweep of my hand. The county sheriff deputy, who had been standing quietly by the porch, cleared his throat. He firmly reminded Linda that she and her daughter were officially trespassing and needed to vacate the premises immediately. Linda did not argue. She did not waive her useless power of attorney document anymore. She looked absolutely hollowed out as she stumbled past me, her designer heels dragging across the concrete walkway. Caitlin followed close behind, keeping her head down, looking like a terrified child, rather than the entitled woman who had stormed into my house just an hour earlier. I stood on the porch and watched them climb into their white Mercedes. The engine roared to life and they sped away down the quiet suburban street, leaving my front lawn littered with the empty cardboard boxes they had planned to use to steal my belongings. I closed the front door, turned the deadbolt, and leaned back against the solid wood. The house was entirely mine again, quiet and secure. I took a deep breath, savoring the profound stillness. I truly believed the worst was over. I assumed the federal authorities would quietly track Connor down, bring him back in handcuffs, and I could peacefully begin the process of untangling my life from his spectacular failures. I grossly underestimated the survival instincts of a cornered, desperate woman. 3 deceptively quiet days passed. I spent the time methodically cataloging the rest of my digital evidence and consulting with my divorce attorney. The local police detective Ramirez called me once to confirm that Connor was still stranded in Mexico, hiding from both the federal authorities and the hotel management. The stolen $8 million remained safely locked behind the automated federal compliance protocols I had triggered. Everything felt neatly tied up. I even managed to sleep through the night for the first time in months. But while I was resting, Ashley was busy clawing her way back across the border. I assumed she would disappear into the shadows, terrified of the wire fraud conspiracy charges hanging over her head. She had, after all, knowingly allowed her downtown luxury condominium and her personal internet connection to be used as the staging ground for a massive corporate theft. Running and hiding would have been the logical choice for a guilty person. But Ashley was a high-end real estate agent who thrived in the cutthroat, shark-infested waters of the luxury housing market. She knew that in a crisis, the person who controls the narrative controls the reality. She knew that sitting back and waiting to be arrested was a guaranteed prison sentence. So instead of hiding, she launched a vicious preemptive strike against me to save her own skin. On Thursday morning, I was sitting at my kitchen island with a cup of hot tea when my phone began vibrating endlessly with notifications. My assistant David, who managed the front desk of my compliance firm, was frantically texting me to check the local news channels. I turned on the television in the living room just in time to see a polished, tearful Ashley standing on the steps of the downtown police precinct. She was surrounded by a swarm of eager local reporters. She looked intentionally disheveled, wearing a simple, modest sweater instead of her usual tailored suits, and her face was bare of makeup to emphasize the dark circles under her eyes. She was giving a masterclass performance of a terrified, traumatized victim. I watched in absolute disgust as she sobbed into a cluster of microphones, claiming she had barely escaped Mexico with her life. Ashley publicly filed a falsified police report right there on live television. She told the press that she and Connor had not run away together for a romantic escape. She spun a wild, elaborate fiction claiming that I was a deeply unstable, controlling wife who had orchestrated the entire $8 million hack out of psychotic jealousy. She told the reporters that I had discovered their innocent friendship and used my advanced cybersecurity skills to frame Connor, draining his accounts and forcing him to flee the country in a blind panic. According to Ashley, Connor had dragged her along because I had allegedly threatened to destroy her life next. She painted herself as a captive who had bravely managed to escape her unhinged kidnapper and return to the United States to tell the truth. The sheer audacity of her lies left me breathless. She knew the federal authorities were still building their complex financial case against Connor, which meant the official details of the investigation were sealed from the public. Ashley exploited that temporary silence to fill the void with her own fabricated narrative. But she did not stop with a dramatic press conference. She immediately leveraged her extensive network of wealthy clients and high society connections. She spent the entire afternoon making personal phone calls to prominent business owners, weeping on the phone and warning them that their financial data was completely unsafe in the hands of a deranged criminal hacker. She systematically poisoned the well, casting me not as a victim of a cheating husband, but as a dangerous, vindictive mastermind who had single-handedly destroyed an innocent man's career. The fallout was devastatingly rapid. My compliance firm relies entirely on trust, discretion, and absolute ethical integrity. By noon, my office phone was ringing non-stop, with panicked calls from my most lucrative corporate clients. They had seen the news broadcast and heard the vicious rumors spreading through the downtown executive circles. They were demanding immediate reassurances, and some were threatening to terminate our contracts on the spot. I tried to remain calm, instructing my staff to assure every client that the allegations were completely false and that we were fully cooperating with a federal investigation. I thought I could weather the temporary public relations storm. Then, the real damage arrived. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a process server knocked aggressively on my front door. He handed me a thick stack of legal documents bearing the seal of the county civil court. I opened the envelope and read the first page, feeling a cold knot of dread form in my stomach. Ashley had retained a ruthless civil litigation attorney. Using the falsified police report and sworn affidavits from Linda and Caitlin backing up her lies, she had convinced a judge that I posed a severe and immediate threat to her safety and her assets. The document in my trembling hands was an emergency injunction. The judge had temporarily frozen all of my business operating accounts and suspended my professional bonding insurance pending a full hearing. I was legally paralyzed. My firm was suddenly bleeding clients, my payroll accounts were locked tight, and my entire professional reputation was violently collapsing around me with alarming speed. I realized I had to act incredibly fast before she completely destroyed my life forever. I stared at the thick stack of legal documents serving as the emergency injunction that had just frozen my entire professional life. Ashley was smart, but I knew she did not have the legal or financial resources to pull off an immediate civil court freeze of this magnitude all by herself. Someone with incredibly deep pockets and a vicious, unrelenting vendetta was funding her legal strike. It did not take long to figure out who it was. By Thursday evening, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law had officially joined forces with my former best friend. Linda and Caitlin had apparently realized that Connor was truly stranded and completely broke in Mexico. Instead of holding him accountable for his massive corporate theft and his infidelity, they decided that destroying me was the only way to save their precious family reputation. They formed a toxic, undeniable alliance with Ashley, deciding to burn my life to the ground. The local evening news broadcasts were absolutely dominated by their coordinated smear campaign. I sat in my living room watching the television screen in horrified fascination as Linda stood on the stone steps of the county courthouse. She was flanked by Caitlin and Ashley, all three of them holding hands in a sickening display of manufactured solidarity. Linda was crying, producing genuine-looking tears as she spoke to the cluster of eager reporters. She painted a tragic, heartbreaking picture of her son, describing Connor as a brilliant, innocent man who had been driven to the brink of insanity by my severe psychological abuse. She told the cameras that I was a deeply disturbed woman who used my advanced cybersecurity skills to illegally monitor his every move, isolate him from his loving family, and ultimately frame him for a financial crime he did not commit. Caitlin stepped up to the microphones next, adding that they had not heard from Connor since he fled the country in sheer terror. She looked directly into the camera and demanded that the federal authorities investigate me for extortion and domestic terrorism, claiming I was a monster. The public narrative turned against me with a speed that left me completely breathless. Social media platforms exploded with viral video clips of Linda weeping for her missing son and Ashley recounting her harrowing tale of escaping my alleged kidnapping plot. I was no longer an anonymous corporate compliance auditor. I was suddenly the most hated woman in Seattle. Anonymous internet vigilantes began digging up my personal information, posting my home address, my private phone number, and the exact location of my boutique firm online. By Friday morning, the digital outrage spilled over into the physical world. When I looked out the front window of my home office, I saw a small but highly vocal group of angry protesters gathered on the public sidewalk across the street. They were holding hastily made cardboard signs demanding absolute justice for Connor and calling me a corporate thief. Several local news vans were parked at the end of my block, their large camera lenses pointed directly at my front door, waiting patiently for me to emerge so they could ambush me with hostile questions about my non-existent crimes. The true devastation, however, was happening behind the scenes of my business. My compliance firm handles highly sensitive data security for massive technology conglomerates and regional healthcare networks. These wealthy corporations simply cannot afford to be associated with any hint of scandal, public controversy, or financial impropriety. My office phone line, which I had forwarded to my personal cellular device after the accounts were frozen, began ringing endlessly. The chief executive officers and senior board members of my top 3 client accounts were calling me in a state of absolute panic. They had seen the morning news broadcasts and the viral videos of Ashley and Linda. The director of a massive regional hospital network explicitly told me that their board of directors was convening an emergency meeting regarding my contract. He informed me that despite my flawless track record over the past 5 years, the public optics were simply too toxic to ignore. He delivered a harsh, non-negotiable ultimatum. If I could not legally and publicly clear my name by the end of the business week, they would invoke the morality clause in our contract, terminate our working relationship immediately, and demand a full and vicious refund of their substantial annual retainer. My technology clients echoed the exact same sentiment. My entire professional life, built on years of grueling hard work and sleepless nights, was about to be wiped out in a matter of days. My phone constantly buzzed with incoming calls from various crisis management and public relations firms. They were leaving desperate voicemails, offering to represent me and advising me to immediately schedule an exclusive tearful television interview to counter Ashley and Linda. They told me I needed to play the sympathetic, heartbroken wife on camera to win back the court of public opinion before it was entirely too late. I refused to answer their calls, and I absolutely refused to play that pathetic game. I knew that fighting a public battle of emotions against 3 women who were perfectly willing to perjure themselves on live television was a guaranteed losing strategy. The public loves a dramatic weeping victim, and Linda was playing the role of the grieving, desperate mother far too well. I could not fight their elaborate lies with my own emotional display. I had to fight their lies with cold, irrefutable data. I knew the only way to stop this public execution was to go directly to the source of the massive financial panic. I needed to speak to the powerful people who were actually missing the $8 million, the people whose opinions truly mattered in this high-stakes corporate warfare. I ignored the angry protesters shouting loudly outside my window. I ignored the ringing phones and the threatening text messages flooding my inbox. I sat down at my custom server rack and pulled up the encrypted shadow logs I had previously exported for the federal agents. I made a highly secure secondary copy of the entire dataset. I did not just include the remote desktop trace routing that definitively proved Connor and Ashley executed the theft from her downtown luxury condominium. I also included the heavily redacted, highly classified files I had been meticulously compiling over the last 8 months of my completely secret investigation. I transferred all of this explosive data onto a single, deeply encrypted flash drive. I placed the small, heavy metal drive into the pocket of my tailored blazer. I was not going to a television studio, and I was not going to cry to a local reporter for public sympathy. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct private number of Mr. Gallagher, the senior partner at the massive venture capital firm Connor had just robbed. I requested an immediate off-the-books meeting at his private corporate office. I told him I had the exact evidence he desperately needed to explain the missing $8 million to his furious investors, and I promised to show him exactly how his junior executive had compromised their entire network. I grabbed my car keys, fully prepared to walk straight through the aggressive crowd of news cameras to deliver the absolute destruction of my husband's entire fabricated narrative. I stepped out of my front door and was immediately engulfed by a blinding flash of camera lenses and a chorus of shouted questions from the local reporters gathered on my lawn. I did not block the aggressive journalists shoving microphones toward my face. I simply walked completely through the chaotic, angry crowd, climbed into my car, and drove directly toward the towering reflective glass skyscrapers of the busy downtown financial district. I parked in the secure underground garage of the corporate tower and took the executive elevator up to the top floor. The venture capital firm was normally a hive of quiet, confident energy, but today the atmosphere was thick with palpable panic. The executive receptionist at the front desk looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, clearly recognizing my face from the morning news broadcasts. She picked up her phone with trembling fingers, whispered a few urgent words, and pointed me toward the heavy oak doors of the senior partner's corner office. I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped inside. Mr. Gallagher was pacing furiously behind his massive mahogany desk, his expensive tailored suit jacket discarded on a nearby chair, and his silk tie pulled loose. He stopped pacing the second I entered the room, his eyes narrowing with intense, unfiltered hostility. He immediately launched into a brutal, calculated verbal assault. He told me my presence was a severe legal liability, and that his board of directors was convening an emergency meeting to handle the catastrophic public relations nightmare I had created. Mr. Gallagher forcefully slammed both of his hands down on his desk. He informed me that the firm's lawyers were actively drafting a comprehensive public statement that would be released to the press within the hour. It would disavow any professional connection to my firm and place the entire blame for the missing $8 million squarely on my shoulders. He demanded that I immediately sign a full written confession and surrender my business assets to his legal team, threatening to bury me under a mountain of relentless civil litigation if I refused. I let him finish his aggressive tirade without interrupting a single word. I slowly approached his desk, pulled out the heavy leather chair opposite him, and sat down. I reached into the pocket of my tailored blazer and withdrew the encrypted metal flash drive, setting it gently on the glass surface between us. Then I pulled a thick manila envelope from my bag. I extracted a single, heavily redacted sheet of paper, bearing the official seal of the United States Department of Justice, and slid it across the expansive desk into his line of sight. Mr. Gallagher stared down at the document, his hostile expression faltering slightly as his eyes caught the bold federal letterhead. He picked up the paper, his gaze darting across the thick black lines of redaction until he reached the unredacted paragraphs at the bottom of the page. The angry flush in his cheeks drained away, replaced by a sickly pallor. His hands began to tremble very slightly as he read the official signatures and the specific federal classification codes. He slowly lowered the paper to the desk, looking up at me with an expression of profound confusion and dawning horror. I leaned forward, folding my hands together on his desk, and kept my voice pitched low and entirely devoid of emotion. I told him that he was looking at my active federal contracting credentials. I revealed that my boutique data privacy firm was not just a small-time civilian operation that handled standard corporate compliance audits. For the past 8 months, I had been working as a highly classified confidential informant and lead forensic contractor directly for the cyber division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I was authorized to monitor, trace, and intercept highly sensitive financial data moving through domestic corporate networks. Mr. Gallagher sank heavily into his leather executive chair, all the aggressive fight completely knocked out of him. He stammered, his voice cracking. asking if the federal government had been secretly investigating his firm for standard corporate embezzlement. He assumed I had placed the digital tripwires on my own network because I knew my husband was planning to steal from his wealthy tech investors. He desperately tried to justify the situation, claiming that the firm had no idea Connor was a thief, and begging me to tell the agents that the senior partners were entirely innocent. I calmly shook my head, shattering his desperate assumptions. I informed him that the Federal Bureau did not flag Connor because of a standard corporate theft, and they certainly did not care about the venture capital firm's wealthy technology investors. I told him that Connor had not just stolen random corporate funds from a standard holding account. In his blind greed, my husband bypassed the primary investor portfolios and tapped into a highly encrypted shadow account that your firm unknowingly hosted on a legacy server. Mr. Gallagher looked like he was about to be physically sick right there in his immaculate office. He gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning stark white, and asked me in a barely audible whisper whose money Connor had actually managed to steal. I held his terrified gaze, delivering the ultimate horrifying truth, without a single ounce of pity. I held his terrified gaze and told him the money did not belong to any investor whose name appeared in the firm's ordinary records. The account had been buried inside an obsolete server environment, disguised beneath layers of dormant entities and routine-looking internal transfers. My audit had flagged it months earlier, but the ownership trail was protected by restrictions far beyond the authority of a private compliance contractor. Mr. Gallagher immediately asked whether his firm had been laundering money. I told him I had no evidence that the board had knowingly participated, but ignorance would not shield the company from scrutiny. A hidden account had operated inside infrastructure carrying his firm's name, and one of his executives had just accessed it using stolen credentials. That combination guaranteed a federal response. I turned the encrypted flash drive toward him and explained that it contained two separate evidence packages. The first documented Connor's remote intrusion, Ashley's device, and the exact route used to frame my residential network. The second contained the internal anomalies my team had been tracing for 8 months. He was not authorized to open that portion himself. It could only be reviewed by the Federal Cyber Unit once they arrived with the proper warrants. Mr. Gallagher's fear shifted into a more disciplined kind of panic. He stopped asking how to protect the firm's public image and began asking what he needed to preserve. I instructed him not to delete a single email, suspend a single employee account, or shut down any legacy server. Any attempt to clean the system now could be interpreted as obstruction, even if his staff believed they were containing a breach. He needed to freeze normal administrative changes, secure the physical server rooms, and make every senior partner available for immediate questioning. He asked again whose money Connor had taken. I told him only that the account was connected to an active federal investigation involving international financial crime, and that revealing more before the agents arrived could compromise operations already in motion. The answer visibly unsettled him more than any specific name could have. He finally understood that the $8 million was not the center of the crisis. It was the door Connor had opened. I retrieved the federal authorization sheet and left the flash drive on his desk, under one condition: he was not to insert it into any company computer. A federal forensic team would collect it directly. I advised him to cancel the press statement blaming me, notify his outside counsel that the firm was entering a preservation hold, and prepare the board for a sealed federal intervention before the end of the business day. I left the terrified senior partner sitting frozen behind his massive mahogany desk and walked out of the corner office. The frantic energy of the venture capital firm had completely shifted from aggressive damage control to absolute paralyzed horror. The executive receptionist did not even look at me as I passed her desk. She was too busy staring at her ringing phone, likely receiving the first of many calls from the federal authorities, who were already mobilizing across the city. I rode the elevator down to the underground parking garage in complete silence, allowing the adrenaline to slowly fade from my bloodstream. For the first time since Connor sent that arrogant text message from his tropical getaway, I felt a genuine sense of control returning to my life. I had successfully contained the immediate professional fallout, but I knew the personal war was far from over. While I was meticulously dismantling the corporate threat downtown, my husband was experiencing a very different kind of reality check south of the border. Stripped of his cash, abandoned by his mistress, and completely locked out of his financial accounts, Connor had somehow managed to scrape his way back into the United States. He could not use his flagged passport to fly, so he resorted to sneaking across the border on foot, catching cheap bus rides, and hitchhiking his way up the West Coast. The man who had demanded a presidential suite just days prior arrived back in Seattle looking like a completely broken vagrant. He had no luggage, no expensive watches, and no dignity left to his name. But Connor did not return with a sense of remorse. His towering ego simply could not process the magnitude of his own failure. Instead of turning himself in to the authorities to quietly negotiate his surrender, he immediately sought out the only people left on Earth who would still blindly validate his delusions. He secretly met up with his mother, his sister, and Ashley at a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city. Ashley had apparently decided that sticking close to the family was her best defense against the wire fraud conspiracy charges hanging over her head. Together, trapped in a dingy motel room, they convinced themselves that they could still win the public narrative and force me into submission. Connor spun a masterful, pathetic tale for his mother. He sat on the edge of a stained motel bed and wept, telling Linda that I had set him up from the very beginning. He claimed that I was a vindictive, controlling monster who had used my advanced computer skills to frame him for the corporate theft, all because I was insanely jealous of his innocent friendship with Ashley. Linda, completely blinded by her maternal bias and her deep-seated hatred for me, swallowed every single lie without question. She genuinely believed her golden child was the tragic victim of my malicious hacking. Caitlin nodded right along with them, furious that her brother's wealth had evaporated, while Ashley played the role of the traumatized hostage who had barely escaped my supposed wrath. They decided that the only way to save Connor from federal prison and restore their high society reputation was to launch a massive, overwhelming legal strike against me. But high-profile legal representation requires massive amounts of immediate cash, something none of them currently possessed. Ashley's business accounts were dwindling, and Connor was literally penniless. This left Linda as the sole remaining source of capital. Driven by her desperate need to protect her son and destroy me, Linda made the most catastrophic financial decision of her entire life. She contacted a predatory lending agency and took out a massive high-interest loan, using the entirety of her carefully guarded retirement portfolio as collateral. She essentially mortgaged her entire future to fund her son's arrogant delusion. With a fresh infusion of cash, Connor hired a sleazy, highly aggressive civil litigation shark known for destroying reputations in the tabloids. The attorney specialized in creating overwhelming public spectacles, using the media to batter opponents into fast, quiet settlements. He took one look at Connor's fabricated story and Ashley's falsified police report and saw an opportunity to make a massive name for himself. He immediately went to work drafting the most vicious, comprehensive lawsuit imaginable. I was sitting at my kitchen island on a quiet Tuesday morning when the aggressive pounding returned to my front door. It was a private process server holding a stack of legal documents that was easily 2 inches thick. I signed for the envelope, carried it back to my kitchen, and began reading the absurd allegations. Connor and his attorney had officially filed a massive civil lawsuit against me for severe defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and something they creatively labeled as spousal extortion. The legal filing was a work of pure, unadulterated fiction. Connor explicitly claimed that I had illegally accessed his venture capital firm's network, transferred the $8 million into a hidden offshore account, and then manipulated the digital logs to point the blame at him and Ashley. He formally accused me of holding the stolen funds hostage, demanding that the civil court force me to immediately unfreeze the accounts and return the money to him so he could clear his good name. The lawsuit was designed to overwhelm me with legal fees and crush my spirit. His attorney had already leaked the details of the filing to the local press, ensuring that the morning news cycle was once again dominated by headlines painting me as a deranged, controlling wife who had stolen millions to punish her husband. But filing a frivolous lawsuit was not enough for Connor. He needed to put me in a position where I would be forced to settle out of court to save my business. He knew that my compliance firm relied entirely on discretion and absolute public trust. He knew that if he dragged this fight out in front of my clients, I would lose everything I had built over the last 5 years. He wanted to back me into a corner where I had absolutely no choice but to hand over the money and take the fall for his crimes. To ensure maximum devastation, his attorney filed an emergency motion to mandate a public mediation hearing. They did not want to negotiate in the quiet, private confines of a judge's chambers. They wanted a spectacle. The attorney leveraged a bizarre legal loophole regarding the immediate financial impact on the venture capital firm's investors to force the mediation into a highly visible setting. The judge, swayed by the sheer amount of money involved and the aggressive media circus surrounding the case, granted the motion. I received the official court summons notification an hour after the lawsuit arrived. I stared down at the crisp white paper, feeling a cold, hard knot form in my stomach as I read the designated location for the mandatory mediation. Connor and his shark attorney had not just secured a public hearing, they had strategically forced the mediation to take place at the upcoming annual financial gala. The gala was the most massive, highly publicized networking event in Seattle. It was a lavish, heavily attended charity dinner where every single major technology executive, healthcare director, and wealthy venture capitalist gathered to mingle and make deals. More importantly, it was the exact event where every single one of my highly skeptical corporate clients would be sitting in the audience. Connor had orchestrated a scenario where I would be forced to publicly defend myself against his vicious lies in front of the exact people who held my professional survival in their hands. He believed he had trapped me, confident that I would break under the immense pressure of the glaring spotlight and hand him everything he wanted. He thought the impending public humiliation would finally force me to surrender. He had absolutely no idea what I was preparing to bring to that gala. The week leading up to the annual financial gala was the most isolating of my life. I was virtually barricaded inside my home while local news channels ran endless segments debating my mental stability. My in-laws were relentless. Linda posted daily updates on social media, painting herself as a heartbroken mother fighting a malicious cybercriminal. Caitlin shared links to the civil lawsuit, encouraging her followers to boycott my compliance firm. My professional inbox was a wasteland of canceled contracts. The pressure to settle out of court was immense. My own defense attorney advised me to negotiate a quiet resolution. He told me that fighting a highly publicized civil battle against my husband would bankrupt me in legal fees before I ever saw a courtroom. He urged me to hand Connor whatever cash he needed to drop the defamation suit and try to salvage my ruined reputation. I fired that attorney on the spot. I was not going to negotiate with terrorists, and I was certainly not going to fund the lavish lifestyle of the woman who slept with my husband. Every time my phone rang with another client threatening to invoke their morality clause, my resolve only hardened. Instead of caving to the overwhelming public pressure, I locked myself inside my climate-controlled home office and went to war. I spent every waking hour meticulously constructing an inescapable digital trap. I needed more than just the server logs to completely destroy their narrative. Connor and Ashley were claiming that my hack was a sudden jealous reaction to their innocent friendship. I needed to prove to my corporate clients and to the world that their financial betrayal was deeply premeditated. I reached out to Detective Ramirez, bypassing standard police dispatch to use his direct cellular line. Because my automated system had successfully frozen the cartel funds, my standing with federal authorities was incredibly strong. Ramirez was assigned as my primary liaison. I asked him to run a highly specific query through the financial crimes database, focusing exclusively on Ashley's luxury real estate transactions over the last 12 months. Ramirez warned me that accessing those records required a federal subpoena, but given the massive money laundering implications attached to Connor's name, a federal judge granted the rapid request within hours. When the encrypted files arrived from the precinct, I fed the raw data through my proprietary forensic sorting algorithms. It took my servers less than 30 minutes to uncover the absolute truth. Ashley was not just a romantic getaway partner, she was Connor's primary financial fence. As a high-end real estate agent, Ashley had routine access to massive wire transfers, earnest money deposits, and anonymous corporate housing acquisitions. I cross-referenced her professional commission accounts with the hidden, depleted bank accounts Connor had used before filing for his bankruptcy 3 years ago. The overlapping patterns lit up my ultra-wide monitors like a neon sign. For the past 14 months, Connor had been quietly siphoning money from his legitimate venture capital clients and funneling it into dummy real estate limited liability companies set up entirely by Ashley. She was using her real estate credentials to scrub the stolen money clean, disguising the illegal cash transfers as standard commercial property investments. I traced the digital signature on a fraudulent escrow account directly back to a corrupt notary public who operated out of Ashley's own downtown real estate brokerage firm. They had been draining legitimate accounts for well over a year, slowly building a massive financial nest egg for their new life together. The disastrous $8 million cartel hack was simply their grand finale before vanishing across the border. I compiled every piece of this damning evidence into a streamlined, irrefutable digital presentation. I included the verified bank routing numbers, the forged commercial property deeds, and the specific dates that proved their long-term coordinated criminal conspiracy. I did not just have solid proof of Connor's guilt. I had absolute, undeniable proof that Ashley was the primary architect of the domestic financial fraud. She was not a terrified victim who barely escaped my jealous wrath. She was a calculating corporate thief who was currently committing massive perjury on local television every single morning. I saved the entire presentation onto a secure remote server that I could easily access from any authorized mobile device. I was not going to quietly wait for a private courtroom date months down the line to clear my damaged name. I was going to execute my final justice in front of the most powerful financial executives in the entire city. I was going to use Connor's arrogant public mediation trap exactly against him. The evening of the annual financial gala arrived with a biting chill in the Seattle air. I spent 2 hours getting ready, choosing a sleek, tailored black evening gown that projected absolute professional authority. I pulled my hair back into an elegant style, applied a flawless layer of makeup, and completely erased any visible trace of the profound emotional exhaustion I had endured over the past 2 weeks. I looked like a fierce woman, perfectly in control of her corporate empire, not a desperate wife begging for her reputation back. I drove myself to the grand downtown convention center, my stomach tightening with a cold adrenaline as I handed my keys to the valet. The grand ballroom was breathtakingly spectacular, filled with the quiet, powerful murmur of the city's most elite corporate executives. My arrival caused an immediate, palpable ripple of severe tension through the room. Conversation stopped abruptly as I walked past the velvet-draped tables. I saw the chief executive officers of my top technology clients staring directly at me, their expressions a mixture of deep skepticism and outright hostility. They were waiting to see if I would crumble under the immense weight of the public scandal. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my shoulders back, and my gaze fixed firmly forward. I was a senior forensic auditor walking into the most important presentation of my career. I found my assigned seat near the front of the room, positioned directly next to the raised presentation stage. I did not touch the expensive champagne poured into my glass or engage in forced small talk with the guests seated beside me. I simply sat in perfect silence and waited for the inevitable arrival of the people who had tried to destroy my life. 15 minutes before the formal dinner service began, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung open with aggressive dramatic force. Connor strode into the elegant venue wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo, looking incredibly smug and self-assured. Ashley walked closely by his side wearing a modest designer dress, specifically chosen to make her look fragile and sympathetic. Linda trailed right behind them, her chin raised in absolute victorious defiance. But they did not arrive alone. Connor had deliberately leaked the exact location and the specific time of the public mediation to the local press. He and Ashley were flanked by a small swarm of aggressive tabloid reporters and independent camera crews explicitly violating the private nature of the corporate gala. They marched directly down the center aisle of the ballroom, their camera flashes firing aggressively. Connor locked eyes with me across the crowded room, a cruel, triumphant smile spreading across his face. He believed he had me completely cornered, ready to publicly demand my immediate resignation and force me to hand over the frozen millions. The camera flashes followed him down the center aisle, capturing the confidence of a man who believed the room had already accepted his version of the truth. The blinding flashes from the tabloid cameras illuminated the sheer arrogance on my husband's face as he led his small, toxic entourage straight toward the main stage at the front of the ballroom. The organizers of the financial gala stepped forward, attempting to block the uninvited press and maintain the formal decorum of the evening. However, Connor's sleazy civil litigation attorney immediately intercepted them. He aggressively waved a stack of court documents in the faces of the event staff, loudly citing the emergency judge's order that mandated a public mediation hearing. The attorney threatened to sue the convention center and the event organizers for obstruction of justice if they dared to interfere. The flustered staff, desperate to avoid a massive legal liability, reluctantly stepped aside and allowed Connor to hijack the entire event. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the grand ballroom. Hundreds of the wealthiest technology executives, healthcare directors, and venture capitalists in Seattle sat frozen at their draped tables, setting down their expensive crystal glasses to watch the unfolding spectacle. I remained perfectly still in my seat near the front, my posture straight, and my hands folded calmly in my lap. I watched Connor stride confidently up the short flight of stairs and walk directly to the center podium. He adjusted his expensive tuxedo jacket, gripped the edges of the wooden podium, and leaned into the primary microphone. Connor lowered his head and let a carefully measured silence settle over the ballroom. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft enough to sound wounded but loud enough for every camera to capture. He apologized for interrupting the gala and claimed that a private marital dispute had grown into a financial crisis affecting innocent investors. He said I had become suspicious of his friendship with Ashley and had used my access as a compliance contractor to manipulate the firm's systems. According to him, the $8 million transfer, the remote connection, and the evidence stored on my servers were all parts of a single elaborate frame-up. He insisted that he and Ashley fled because they believed I intended to have them arrested before they could expose me. Ashley stood below the stage with her eyes lowered, gripping a tissue in both hands. Linda watched the audience rather than her son, measuring whether the performance was working. Connor's attorney moved through the front row, distributing copies of the civil complaint to selected executives and reporters. Then Connor shifted from victimhood to accusation. He warned the corporate leaders in the room that anyone who trusted my firm was placing sensitive data in the hands of a woman willing to weaponize private information against her own husband. He demanded that my contracts be suspended until I surrendered the evidence and released the frozen funds. Linda rose on cue and reinforced the attack. She described Connor as a terrified son driven out of the country by an unstable wife and urged the executives to protect themselves before I targeted another company. Her words produced exactly the reaction they wanted. Several guests exchanged uneasy looks, and the hospital director 2 tables away stared at me with open distrust. Connor's attorney carried a settlement agreement to the edge of the stage. It required me to accept responsibility for the transfer, relinquish control of the frozen money, and surrender a substantial share of my business assets. Connor leaned toward the microphone and presented the document as a final opportunity to end the scandal quietly. He expected tears, anger, or a desperate attempt to defend myself. I remained seated for one final beat, allowing every lie to settle into the record. Connor mistook my silence for surrender and waited for me to break. I did not cry. I did not yell. I slowly stood up from my chair and smoothed the front of my tailored black evening gown. I did not look like a broken, defeated wife. I looked completely and utterly bored. A collective gasp rippled through the audience as I calmly walked past Linda, entirely ignoring her shrill demands for my removal. I walked up the short flight of stairs to the stage. Connor's triumphant smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he held his ground at the center podium, assuming I was coming up to surrender. I bypassed him completely. I walked over to the secondary presentation podium located on the far right side of the stage. This was the podium normally used by guest speakers to control the massive digital projection screens that spanned the entire back wall of the ballroom. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small encrypted wireless receiver. I plugged it directly into the secure audiovisual port on the control panel. Connor's attorney immediately began shouting objections from the floor, yelling that I had no legal right to present unauthorized materials. The local tabloid reporters pushed forward against the velvet ropes, their cameras rolling continuously, sensing a massive shift in the dramatic confrontation. Connor turned toward me, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. He covered his microphone with his hand and hissed at me under his breath, demanding to know what I was doing and warning me not to make things worse for myself. I simply pulled a small remote control from my pocket. I met the skeptical gaze of the hospital director and pressed a single button on my remote. The bright lighting in the grand ballroom instantly dimmed. The massive projection screens behind the stage went entirely black. Then the massive screens flashed vividly back to life. They displayed two bright green, constantly shifting digital audio waveforms. They were set against a stark, pitch-black background screen. The sudden shift in the atmosphere of the grand ballroom was absolute and immediate. The sharp, vibrant green lines of the digital audio waveforms pulsed rhythmically against the pitch-black screens, dominating the visual space of the entire room. A low electronic hiss filtered through the massive high-fidelity sound system that had been meticulously set up for the evening's prestigious keynote speakers. The aggressive murmuring chatter from the tabloid reporters instantly ceased, replaced by a strained, highly expectant quiet. Connor stood frozen at the primary podium, his hand still hovering nervously over the microphone, his eyes darting frantically toward the towering screens behind him. He instantly recognized the specific proprietary interface of my forensic software, and I saw the first genuine spike of terror flash across his previously arrogant face. Before his sleazy civil litigation attorney could shout another hollow legal objection, from the main floor a loud, clear voice boomed out of the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers. It was crisp, perfectly clear, and entirely unmistakable. It was Connor. He was not crying softly into the microphone. He was not speaking in the trembling, broken tone of a terrified hostage running for his life. He sounded incredibly relaxed, immensely arrogant, and slightly intoxicated. The secret recording was captured exactly 21 days ago, meticulously extracted from the encrypted voice-over Internet Protocol application he thought he had successfully hidden on his personal cellular device. The entire gala listened in absolute stunned silence as my husband's voice echoed over the heads of Seattle's financial elite. He was casually complaining about the quality of the room service at the boutique hotel he was currently occupying, laughing about how he deserved so much better. Then, without an ounce of hesitation, he shifted the conversation directly to the massive corporate theft. Connor chuckled a deep, cruel sound that made my mother-in-law Linda physically flinch and grasp the edge of her table in the front row. He explicitly detailed his masterful plan to infiltrate his venture capital firm's legacy servers and transfer $8 million into a hidden offshore account before dawn. He bragged loudly about how incredibly simple the digital heist was going to be, explicitly stating that no one at his prestigious firm would ever suspect a charming junior executive of bypassing the primary administrative firewalls. Then, with a chilling lack of empathy, he brought my name into the conversation. He laughed out loud, assuring his listener that they had absolutely nothing to worry about regarding the digital trail leading back to them. He referred to me as his overglorified tech support wife, openly mocking the 5 grueling years I had spent building my compliance firm from the ground up. He confidently declared to his hidden audience that I was simply too stupid and too fundamentally boring to ever think about checking my own daily router logs. He told the person on the other end of the line that framing me would be the easiest part of the entire grand operation, bragging that he could use my administrative credentials blindfolded while I was asleep in the very next room. The hospital director, sitting 2 tables away, slowly lowered his hands to his lap, his jaw tightly clenched, his eyes darting angrily from the glowing screens to Connor's pale, sweating face on the stage. But the devastating recording was not finished yet. The second green audio waveform on the massive screens suddenly spiked upward, matching a new frequency. A woman's voice filled the silent, breathless ballroom, bright, sharp, and dripping with malicious, undeniable amusement. It was Ashley. She did not sound like a frightened captive victim who had been dragged across the international border against her will and forced to participate in a crime. She sounded absolutely thrilled by the prospect of ruining my life. She laughed cruelly at Connor's vile insults regarding my intelligence, enthusiastically agreeing that I was far too trusting and naive to ever see the ultimate betrayal coming. She then proceeded to meticulously confirm her exact role in the domestic financial fraud, completely destroying her own carefully crafted public alibi. Ashley explicitly stated that she had already configured the necessary decoy remote desktop protocol on her personal high-end laptop, securing the connection for his midnight access. She loudly confirmed that the fake internet protocol address was completely set up and waiting at her luxury downtown condominium, ready to act as the perfect digital mask for the massive $8 million wire transfer. She even joked about making sure she bought a specific brand of extremely expensive champagne to properly celebrate the exact moment the stolen funds cleared the offshore holding accounts. The crystal-clear recording captured her playfully reminding Connor to pack his favorite designer sunglasses for their permanent tropical getaway, promising him that they would be living like absolute royalty on a Mexican beach by the end of the week. I pressed the button on my small remote control one more time. The incriminating audio cut off instantly, leaving the grand ballroom drowning in a heavy, suffocating, and thoroughly judgmental silence. The flashing green waveforms vanished entirely from the massive projection screens, replaced once again by the stark, unblinking, professional logo of my compliance firm. Down on the main floor, the carefully constructed illusion of Ashley's immense psychological trauma violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces in front of everyone. The tabloid reporters who had been aggressively snapping sympathetic photos of her fake trembling tears just moments ago slowly lowered their expensive cameras, turning to look at her with profound, unadulterated disgust. Ashley's face drained of all color, her eyes wide with the primal, terrified panic of a trapped animal suddenly realizing there was no escape. She looked wildly around the enormous room, recognizing with absolute certainty that she had just been exposed, committing massive, undeniable perjury in front of the most powerful and influential people in the entire city. Linda sat entirely frozen in the front row, her manicured hands covering her mouth, completely incapable of processing the horrifying reality that her precious innocent son had just confessed to a highly premeditated federal crime. Connor gripped the edges of the wooden podium so hard his knuckles turned stark, painful white. He leaned desperately into the microphone, his voice cracking as he frantically tried to salvage his thoroughly destroyed narrative. He shouted into the silent room that the audio was a sophisticated deepfake, a malicious artificial intelligence manipulation created by my company to ruin his entire life out of spite. He babbled incoherently, begging the wealthy corporate executives to simply ignore the recording and trust his original tearful story. Ashley did not wait to hear the rest of his pathetic, crumbling excuses. She turned abruptly on her expensive heels and made a desperate, panicked sprint toward the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom. She reached out with shaking hands to shove the heavy doors open and escape into the anonymity of the convention center lobby, but the doors were suddenly pushed inward with aggressive, overwhelming force. A large, highly coordinated team of federal agents in dark suits stood shoulder to shoulder in the hallway, completely blocking every single exit. Connor continued to stammer and plead from the stage, pointing an accusing finger directly at me, completely unaware that the audio recording was just the introductory act of my presentation, and that I was currently preparing to reveal the truly horrifying, deadly origin of the massive funds he had stolen. I did not interrupt his frantic, desperate rambling as he stood trembling behind the primary wooden podium. I simply stepped away from the secondary control panel and walked slowly toward the absolute center of the grand stage, my black evening gown brushing softly against the polished floorboards. The blinding flashes from the tabloid cameras completely stopped. The aggressive local reporters who arrived expecting to document my humiliating public surrender were now hanging on my every movement, their recording devices pointed directly at me. I looked out over the sea of powerful technology executives, healthcare directors, and elite venture capitalists. I met the skeptical, furious gaze of the hospital director who had threatened my contract just days prior. His expression transformed from deep disgust to profound shock. I reached out and took the main microphone from Connor's shaking hand. He was too stunned and terrified to attempt to pull it away from me. I addressed the silent ballroom, my voice carrying clear and steady through the massive overhead speakers. I told the captivated audience that my husband spent the last 2 weeks publicly labeling me as a dangerous, unstable cybercriminal. I reminded them that he sat on local television and filed sworn court affidavits claiming I maliciously hacked his prestigious venture capital firm out of pure, uncontrollable jealousy. I turned my head slightly to look at Connor, who was sweating profusely under the bright stage lights. I informed him and the hundreds of executives watching our every move that in order to be legally classified as a hacker, a person must be an unauthorized intruder, illegally breaching a private network. I stated that I never once accessed a network without absolute documented and legally binding authorization. I then looked toward the front row of VIP tables and formally invited Mr. Gallagher, the senior partner of Connor's venture capital firm, to join me on the stage. A collective murmur of astonishment rippled through the grand ballroom as the formidable senior partner slowly stood up from his draped table. Mr. Gallagher did not look like the confident corporate shark who usually commanded these elite networking events. He looked incredibly pale, deeply exhausted, and profoundly defeated. He walked heavily up the short flight of stairs, ignoring Connor's panicked gaze entirely. I stepped back and offered Mr. Gallagher the center microphone. He gripped the edges of the podium, taking a deep, shuddering breath before addressing his peers, his investors, and his furious junior executive. Mr. Gallagher publicly admitted that his prestigious financial firm noticed highly concerning microscopic accounting irregularities hidden deep within their legacy servers over 8 months ago. He explicitly stated that the board of directors did not immediately contact the local police or federal authorities, terrified that a public investigation would cause a massive panic among their wealthy investors. Instead, they decided to handle the situation internally. Mr. Gallagher looked directly at Connor and dropped a devastating truth bomb that completely shattered my husband's fragile reality. He announced that the venture capital firm quietly hired my boutique data privacy and compliance firm to execute a highly classified comprehensive shadow audit on their own internal executive staff. Connor physically staggered backward, his expensive tuxedo shoes slipping slightly on the polished stage floor. He stared at his boss in absolute, unadulterated horror. I stepped back to the microphone, seamlessly taking control of the narrative. I looked directly into Connor's terrified eyes and systematically dismantled the towering, arrogant ego he worshipped for his entire adult life. I told him that I possessed full signed and legally binding authorization from his own board of directors to meticulously monitor his every single digital movement. I had explicit permission to track his keystrokes, shadow his encrypted emails, and map his hidden financial routing protocols. I explained that his ego was so massively inflated, and his profound disrespect for my profession was so deeply ingrained that he never once stopped to consider that the senior partners might hire his over-glorified tech support wife to investigate his crimes. He spent months sitting at our kitchen island, arrogantly drinking his expensive scotch and mocking my compliance firm, completely unaware that I was legally building the exact digital cage that would eventually end his career. The audience sat completely mesmerized, digesting the absolute brilliance of the corporate trap. But my presentation was not finished. I turned my attention away from the stage and looked directly down at the front row, where my mother-in-law Linda and my sister-in-law Caitlin were sitting in stunned silence. They spent years mocking my modest lifestyle, constantly praising Connor as a brilliant financial genius who was entirely out of my league. It was time to permanently destroy the golden pedestal they had placed him on. I pressed a button on the remote, and the screens shifted from the audit authorization to a sequence of authenticated financial records. The entries were not related to the ownership of our house. That question had already been settled. These records explained why Connor had become desperate enough to steal. Over a period of 4 years, he had transferred enormous sums into underground poker rooms, unregulated sports betting platforms, and offshore gambling accounts hidden behind false consulting expenses. The losses began as small, irregular withdrawals, then accelerated into 6-figure transfers made days apart. Each time he lost, he borrowed more, concealed the debt, and used new money to cover the damage caused by the previous wager. The screens displayed the pattern with brutal clarity. Bonuses disappeared within hours of being deposited. Personal credit lines were exhausted. Funds intended for legitimate investments were redirected through accounts Ashley later used in her real estate network. Connor had not suffered one unfortunate financial setback. He had built a private cycle of addiction, deception, and theft. I highlighted several dates. On each one, Connor had told me he was attending an investor dinner or traveling for a merger meeting. The transaction logs showed that he was actually placing high-risk bets while sending Ashley messages about how quickly they could rebuild the money. Their affair and their financial conspiracy had developed together. She was not simply the woman waiting at the end of his escape. She had become the person helping him hide the losses and move the proceeds. Linda stared at the screens as the image of her brilliant, disciplined son collapsed in front of her. Caitlin stopped defending him. The audience no longer saw a successful executive corrupted by one reckless decision. They saw a man who had spent years feeding an addiction with lies and had finally gambled with money dangerous enough to destroy everyone around him. The evidence did not repeat what the room already knew about my property or my independence. It revealed motive. Connor had not stolen $8 million because he wanted freedom. He stole it because every previous deception had failed, his debts were closing in, and he believed one final transfer would erase the consequences. The sheer weight of public humiliation finally snapped whatever fragile thread of sanity Connor was still clinging to on that stage. He completely lost control of his carefully crafted professional facade. He lunged forward, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage, spitting his words into the microphone. He screamed at the top of his lungs that he did not care about the shadow audit, the gambling records, or my presentation. He pointed a furious finger toward the heavy doors at the back of the ballroom, where federal agents still stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking every exit. He frantically demanded the police officers step in, arrest me, and legally force me to release the frozen $8 million back into the venture capital firm's primary accounts so he could clear his name. He genuinely believed the worst thing he had done was commit a standard corporate embezzlement, thinking simply returning the stolen money would magically make his massive legal nightmare disappear. I looked at the pathetic, screaming man I once promised to spend my life with. I did not raise my voice, and I did not flinch from his anger. I simply smiled, a cold, razor-sharp, merciless smile that made his furious ranting instantly die in his throat. I leaned very close to his microphone and told him clearly and calmly, "I cannot release it, Connor, and you better pray the police take you right now." Connor stared at me, his chest heaving as he tried to process my words. He let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh, gripping the wooden podium so tightly his knuckles looked like they might shatter. He leaned back into the microphone, shouting that I was bluffing, that I was just a bitter, jealous wife trying to scare him into a settlement. He demanded that I stop playing games and release the venture capital funds before I ruined both of our lives. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic energy. I turned away from him and looked directly out at the sea of silent, captivated executives in the grand ballroom. I asked them to consider why a boutique compliance auditor would be granted sweeping classified federal security clearances. I reminded the audience of the heavily armed federal agents currently standing shoulder to shoulder, blocking every single exit to the convention center. I asked the room if they truly believed the Federal Bureau of Investigation would deploy a massive tactical unit to a public charity gala just to handle a standard corporate embezzlement case. I looked down at Mr. Gallagher, who was still standing on the stage beside me, shivering in his expensive suit. I asked him to confirm what I had told him in his private office earlier that week. The senior partner could barely speak. He leaned toward his microphone and in a broken, hollow voice admitted to his furious investors that the stolen $8 million did not actually belong to any of their legitimate technology or healthcare portfolios. He confessed that their legacy servers had been unknowingly hosting a highly encrypted shell account. Connor scoffed loudly, interrupting his boss. He yelled that he did not care about a dormant shell account at all. He just wanted the money returned so he could clear his name and leave the country. I turned back to my husband, watching the arrogant delusion clinging to his features. I informed him that the shell account he had clumsily drained was not a tax loophole. I revealed that the specific digital vault he accessed was the primary operational fund for an incredibly violent, internationally recognized money laundering syndicate. The grand ballroom erupted into a collective, horrified gasp. Executives sitting in the front rows physically recoiled, shrinking back in their chairs. I explained that for the past 8 months my compliance firm had been operating under a highly classified federal contract. The cyber division of the Federal Bureau had tasked me with monitoring domestic financial networks to track that exact criminal organization. I told Connor that the syndicate had spent years meticulously hiding their assets across dozens of borders, making it absolutely impossible for the federal government to legally freeze their global infrastructure. They were untouchable until my husband decided to play the role of a corporate thief. I detailed how the syndicate operated with brutal efficiency, funding illegal operations around the globe through seemingly legitimate commercial real estate transactions and buried venture capital holdings. I looked directly at the wealthy investors in the audience and informed them that their prestigious firm had been utterly compromised by my husband's reckless greed long before the $8 million ever went missing. The room was so silent, I could hear the panicked, uneven breathing of my mother-in-law sitting in the front row. I walked closer to him, lowering my voice so it carried a lethal, icy calm through the massive speakers. I explained exactly what happened when he sat in his mistress's luxury condominium and routed the stolen $8 million through my home servers. He thought he was cleverly framing me for grand larceny. Instead, by passing the funds through the automated digital tripwire I had built for the federal authorities, he unwittingly captured and exposed the syndicate's entire hidden offshore routing network. He had handed the United States government the exact digital keys they desperately needed. My automated software did not just intercept his stolen millions, it permanently locked down the cartel's entire global banking system. Connor's arrogant posture instantly collapsed. The cruel, triumphant spark that had fueled his entire public smear campaign vanished from his eyes, replaced by a raw, primal terror. He physically backed away from the podium, shaking his head in frantic denial. He stammered, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper, claiming that he had no idea whose money he was taking. He pleaded with the silent room, swearing that he only wanted to take a fraction of the firm's profits to fund his new life. He begged me to tell the federal authorities that it was all a terrible, tragic mistake. He dropped to his knees on the polished floorboards of the stage. The man who had spent the last 2 weeks publicly destroying my professional reputation was now openly weeping in front of the entire city. He grabbed the hem of my black evening gown, sobbing uncontrollably, completely oblivious to the hundreds of cameras recording his absolute degradation. He repeatedly promised that he would do anything, sign any confession, and publicly apologize to my compliance firm if I would just use my federal security clearances to make the cartel target disappear. I calmly stepped backward, pulling the fabric out of his desperate grasp. I looked at the man who had abandoned me, smeared my name across the local news, and tried to send me to a federal prison. I told him that the federal authorities already knew he acted alone. But more importantly, I told him that the international syndicate also knew he acted alone. I explained that violent cartels do not care about misunderstandings, apologies, or accidental corporate fraud. They only care that a junior executive from Seattle completely dismantled their untouchable financial empire in a single night. I watched the profound, suffocating realization settle over his features. He finally understood that his life as he knew it was permanently over. He could not hire a sleazy civil litigation attorney to sue a global criminal organization. He could not launch a manipulative social media smear campaign to convince a violent cartel that he was the victim. All of his usual narcissistic tactics were completely useless against an entity that operated entirely outside the boundaries of the law. The sheer, inescapable reality of his situation crushed whatever remaining defiance he held. He had spent his entire adult life projecting the illusion of limitless power, manipulating everyone around him with arrogant ease. But in just a few excruciating minutes, I had stripped away every single layer of his manufactured superiority. He was simply a terrified, broken man who had blindly stumbled into a fatal criminal trap of his own making. Connor looked wildly toward the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom. The federal agents were no longer standing passively in the hallway. They were marching down the center aisle, their tactical gear and severe expressions parting the sea of wealthy executives. He reached out toward the approaching officers as if they were his saviors. He screamed that he was ready to confess to the corporate theft, begging them to arrest him and take him to a safe, secure jail cell. I stood over my trembling husband and delivered the final, inescapable truth. I told him the agents were not moving in to arrest him for embezzlement. They were moving in to take him into immediate, highly classified protective custody because the syndicate was already hunting him and he was a dead man walking. The federal team moved the instant Connor's final words left the speakers. 2 agents climbed the stage and secured his arms before he could run, while the rest spread through the ballroom to seal the exits and separate the principal suspects. Connor did not understand the coordination. He assumed he was being arrested immediately and began shouting that he wanted a lawyer. The agents forced him away from the microphone, searched him for weapons and electronic devices, and held him at the base of the stage while their supervisor issued instructions through a concealed radio. The ballroom remained under controlled lockdown. No guest was permitted to leave, and every camera continued recording. Mr. Gallagher stood motionless near the podium, watching federal personnel move toward members of his legal and information technology teams. The prestigious gala had transformed into a live evidence scene. Linda rose so quickly that her chair struck the table behind her. She stared at Connor in disbelief, but the agents blocked her from reaching him. Caitlin grabbed her mother's arm, whispering frantically that they needed to call the attorney. Across the room, Ashley began edging toward the rear doors, pretending to search for someone in the crowd. Her movement was subtle, but several agents had already marked her position. Connor twisted against the grip on his arms and demanded to know whether the syndicate could reach him. No one answered. That silence frightened him more than the handcuffs would have. For the first time, he stopped performing for the cameras and looked genuinely terrified. The agents did not remove him yet. Their operation required the room to remain stable until every warrant, device, and suspect had been accounted for. Connor was kept under guard in full view of the audience, stripped of the stage, the microphone, and the authority he had tried to project. He could hear the reporters documenting every development and see the executives who had once respected him turning away in disgust. Linda did not shrink away in shame. Desperation overrode her pride. She scrambled up the short flight of stairs to the stage, her expensive heels catching slightly on the edge of the carpet. She rushed directly toward me, her hands reaching out in a frantic, pathetic attempt to grab my arms. I took a deliberate step backward, putting a safe distance between us, and held up my hand to stop her advance. Linda ignored the boundary tears streaming down her face as she launched into a breathless, hysterical plea. She begged me to call Detective Ramirez to use my classified federal security clearances to talk to the agents and to somehow make the cartel target disappear. She cried that Connor was just a foolish boy who made a terrible mistake. She looked me right in the eyes and dared to invoke the word family. She claimed that despite our minor disagreements, we were still legally bound to each other, and I had a moral obligation to save my husband's life. I looked down at the woman who had stormed into my house with a moving crew, who had stood on the courthouse steps, and told local news reporters that I was a psychotic monster. I did not raise my voice, but my tone was cold enough to freeze the air between us. I told her that I was no longer her family. I reminded her that she had spent the last 5 years mocking my career actively, encouraging my husband's infidelity, and celebrating the destruction of my marriage. I told Linda that I could not save Connor, and even if I possessed the power to do so, I would not lift a single finger to help him. Linda began to sob louder, threatening to hire the best private defense attorneys in the country to fight the federal government. She screamed that she would spend every last dime she had to protect her son. I gave her a long, steady look and reminded her that she had already committed every available dollar to Connor's lawsuit. The loan she secured was not a harmless line of credit. It was backed by her retirement portfolio, the equity in her home, and personal guarantees that became enforceable the moment the litigation collapsed. Linda tried to insist that Connor would repay everything once the frozen money was released. I told her there would be no release to him. His accounts were under federal restraint, his civil claims had just been destroyed by authenticated evidence, and the attorney she hired would have no reason to continue representing a client who could no longer pay. I did not predict the exact date she would lose her home, and I did not need to. I simply told her to read the documents she had signed. The lender had broad rights to review and seize collateral if the borrower's financial position materially deteriorated. Connor's arrest, the collapse of the lawsuit, and the exposure of the fraud would trigger that review almost immediately. Her expression changed as she finally understood that she had not merely paid a legal bill. She had tied her future to the outcome of her son's lies. Every asset she had spent decades protecting was now exposed to people who did not care about family loyalty, public sympathy, or excuses. I told her the federal government would decide Connor's fate. The lender would decide hers. Neither decision belonged to me, and I would not intervene in either one. The certainty of what she had risked finally reached her, and her knees began to give way beneath her. While Linda collapsed to her knees on the stage, weeping over her ruined life, a different kind of justice was being executed at the back of the grand ballroom. Ashley had tried to slip away during the chaos of Connor's extraction, hoping to blend in with the frightened executives and disappear into the night. But my federal liaisons knew exactly what she looked like, and they knew exactly what she had done. 2 federal agents intercepted her just inches from the exit. Ashley immediately tried to leverage her polished high society real estate persona. She flashed a brilliant fake smile, tossing her hair, and attempting to charm her way past the officers, claiming she was just an innocent bystander who needed to get home. The agents did not smile back. One of them pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt, ordering her to turn around and place her hands behind her back. Ashley's calm facade instantly shattered. She began to shriek, fighting against the agent's grip, demanding to know why she was being detained. I walked to the edge of the stage, looking down the long center aisle at my former best friend. I spoke into the microphone, ensuring my voice carried across the silent room. I informed Ashley that she was being placed under federal arrest for felony wire fraud conspiracy. I reminded her that she had knowingly allowed her luxury downtown condominium and her personal internet connection to be used as a staging ground for a massive corporate theft. I also noted that the local police were filing secondary charges against her for submitting a deliberately falsified police report and committing massive perjury on live television. Ashley stopped fighting long enough to stare at the agents in disbelief. I spoke into the microphone and stated only what the evidence already established. She was being detained in connection with wire fraud conspiracy, the use of her condominium and personal devices to facilitate the remote intrusion, and the false police report she had submitted after returning from Mexico. I made it clear that the arrest was not a theatrical act arranged for the gala. Federal investigators had authenticated the device records, traced the escrow transfers, and obtained warrants before anyone entered the ballroom. The recording the audience had just heard was only the public confirmation of a case that had already been built. Several of Ashley's former clients were seated close enough to hear every word. She looked toward them instinctively, searching for sympathy, but found none. These were people who had trusted her with private transactions, large deposits, and confidential corporate structures. Now they understood that the same access had been used to disguise stolen money. I added that the State Real Estate Commission had been notified and had issued an emergency suspension pending the criminal proceedings. Her permanent professional status would be determined after the evidence was reviewed and the court entered judgment. Until then, she was prohibited from handling client funds, escrow accounts, or property transactions. That distinction made the moment more credible and more devastating. I was not announcing a punishment before trial. I was stating the immediate consequences of documented conduct. Ashley's career was no longer protected by charm, reputation, or wealthy connections. It was now controlled by investigators, regulators, and a criminal court. The agents turned her toward the exit and secured the handcuffs around her wrists. Her head dropped as the people who once formed the foundation of her business watched her being led away. Caitlin watched her mother weeping helplessly on the floorboards and finally comprehended the sheer magnitude of their collective destruction. She dropped to her knees beside Linda, wrapping her arms around the older woman as the last shreds of their manufactured dignity evaporated under the glaring stage lights. They had walked into this venue expecting to witness my ultimate professional execution. Instead, they were leaving with absolutely nothing, their family legacy burned to the ground by the very son they had blindly worshipped. I looked down at both of them and felt absolutely no pity. Only the cold, hard satisfaction of justice served perfectly ice cold. I turned my attention away from the shattered remnants of my in-laws and looked toward the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The two massive federal agents who apprehended my husband were not gentle in their execution. They maintained a punishing, unyielding grip on Connor's arms, carrying his dead weight across the thick carpet. The man who had walked into this prestigious venue less than an hour ago, wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo and an expression of untouchable superiority, was now dragging the toes of his expensive leather shoes along the floorboards. His meticulously styled hair hung in damp, sweat-soaked strands across his pale forehead. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving with sharp, ragged breaths, as the suffocating terror of his reality fully consumed his mind. He was not just going to a federal prison. He was being thrust into a classified protection program because a violent international syndicate was actively hunting him down. The polished, arrogant venture capitalist had been entirely erased, leaving behind nothing but a whimpering, terrified shell of a human being. As the agents hauled him past the front row of draped tables, Connor suddenly dug the heels of his shoes into the thick carpeting. He threw his entire body weight backward in a frantic attempt to stall his inevitable exit. The sudden resistance caused the agents to pause for a fraction of a second to adjust their tactical grips. It was just enough time for Connor to twist his upper body around and lock his panic-stricken eyes directly onto mine. I was still standing perfectly still near the edge of the presentation stage, looking down at the absolute wreckage of his life. Connor stopped fighting the physical restraint of the federal agents and poured his desperate energy into a pathetic weeping plea. He screamed my name across the captivated ballroom. He no longer sounded angry or demanding. He sounded like a terrified, begging child. He openly sobbed, the tears streaming freely down his flushed cheeks and dripping onto the collar of his tuxedo shirt. He pleaded with me, swearing blindly that he had made a catastrophic, unforgivable mistake. He cried out that he never actually wanted to hurt me, claiming that the stress of his hidden gambling debts had completely fractured his sanity. He begged me to remember the 5 years we had spent together, invoking the sacred vows of our marriage, as if he had not just spent the last 3 weeks trying to send me to a concrete prison cell for a decade. He leaned forward against the grasp of the officers and frantically begged me to use my federal clearances to help him. He shouted that because I was a classified forensic contractor, I had the direct connections to negotiate with the authorities. He pleaded with me to talk to the agents, secure him a safe location, and somehow erase the massive target the international syndicate had just placed on his back. He promised that he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me, swearing that he still loved me, and that we could somehow fix the horrific damage he had caused. He offered to sign whatever legal confessions I wanted to publicly clear my professional name in front of the press, and to surrender absolutely everything he owned if I would just step in and save his life. I stood on the stage and looked down at the weeping, pathetic man who was supposed to be my partner in life. I felt not a single flicker of compassion. I did not feel the sudden, overwhelming urge to protect him that he was desperately banking on. I simply looked at him and remembered the exact moment the federal agents kicked down my front door while my coffee grew cold. I remembered the calculated cruelty of his text message from the tropical resort and the arrogant, mocking tone of his voice on the secret audio recording as he laughed about my intelligence with his mistress. He had maliciously planned my absolute destruction, willing to sacrifice my freedom, my compliance firm, and my future just to fund a luxurious escape. He did not love me, and he was not sorry for what he had done. He was only sorry that his elaborate, arrogant trap violently snapped shut around his own ankles. I did not raise my voice to shout over his frantic weeping. I did not hurl insults, demand an apology, or deliver a long emotional speech about my broken heart. I knew that demonstrating extreme emotional distress would only give him the pathetic satisfaction of knowing he had successfully wounded me. I refused to grant him even that tiny victory. Instead, I maintained my perfect, unwavering posture. I looked down into his terrified, pleading eyes, allowing the heavy silence of the grand ballroom to amplify the absolute finality of my response. I looked at the man who had tried to bury me alive, and I calmly repeated the exact 4 words I had sent him on the very first day of his monumental betrayal. I said, "Good luck with that." The words hung in the cold air of the Grand Convention Center, striking Connor with the physical force of a sledgehammer. The last remaining glimmer of desperate hope instantly vanished from his eyes, replaced by a hollow, profound despair. He finally understood that I was not a forgiving wife or a sympathetic victim. I was the architect of his absolute ruin, and I was immune to his tears. He let out a loud, agonizing wail of pure defeat, his head dropping forward onto his chest as all the fight drained out of his body. The 2 federal agents did not give him another moment to beg. They adjusted their firm, tactical grips and forcefully marched him down the remainder of the center aisle. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung wide open, revealing the dark, waiting expanse of the convention center lobby. Connor was hauled through the exit, his weeping cries abruptly cut off as the massive doors slammed shut behind him, sealing his fate forever. For 5 long seconds, the grand ballroom remained suspended in an absolute breathless silence. The hundreds of wealthy technology executives, powerful healthcare directors, and elite venture capitalists sat completely frozen at their draped tables, processing the sheer magnitude of the corporate and personal destruction they had just witnessed. They had arrived at the prestigious networking event expecting to watch my professional execution. Instead, they watched me systematically dismantle a massive domestic fraud, expose an international money laundering syndicate, and deliver a flawless, ice-cold reckoning to the people who tried to destroy my life. Then, somewhere in the very middle of the expansive room, a single person began to clap. The initial sound was sharp and deliberate. Within seconds, a second person joined in, followed by a third. The polite, isolated applause rapidly swelled, building into a deafening, overwhelming roar of absolute validation. The same influential corporate executives who had threatened to terminate my security contracts just days prior were now rising from their chairs, delivering a thunderous standing ovation for my absolute dismantling of the fraud. I stood quietly on the stage, looking out over the applauding crowd, taking a deep breath of the cool air, knowing with absolute certainty that I had not just saved my life, my compliance firm, and my future. I had completely and undeniably conquered it for good. The quiet, deeply satisfying days immediately following the chaotic annual financial gala moved with a swift and entirely merciless efficiency. The highly destructive public spectacle I masterfully orchestrated did not simply end when the heavy ballroom doors closed. It ignited a massive, unrelenting chain of legal and personal consequences that methodically dismantled the lives of everyone who had conspired against me. I did not have to lift another finger or file another lawsuit. I simply sat back in the quiet comfort of my secured home and watched the absolute unfiltered reality of strict accountability take its natural course over the next 6 months. Connor never saw the inside of a comfortable white-collar holding cell, because his reckless corporate theft directly intertwined with the global operational funds of an international money laundering syndicate. The federal government treated him as a severe national security liability. He was placed under heavy tactical guard during his initial hearings, terrified of his own shadow. His high-profile civil litigation attorney dropped him the very next morning, refusing to be associated with a case involving federal wire fraud and cartel money. Left completely abandoned by the expensive legal sharks he thought would save him, Connor was assigned an overworked public defender who took one look at the mountain of irrefutable digital evidence I had provided and advised him to surrender immediately. Facing a potential lifetime behind bars if he took the case to a public trial, Connor accepted a brutal, non-negotiable plea deal. He was sentenced to a full decade in a high-security federal penitentiary. He traded his custom-tailored tuxedos and luxury corporate suites for a sterile concrete box. Through my federal liaisons, I learned that Connor spends every single day looking over his shoulder, consumed by the paralyzing, suffocating fear that the international syndicate will eventually find a way to reach him behind the prison walls. He wanted a life of thrilling, high-stakes international adventure. He got exactly what he asked for, but it arrived permanently wrapped in razor-sharp barbed wire and absolute suffocating paranoia. He will spend the next 10 years regretting the day he decided to underestimate his wife. His grand ambition ultimately became the very instrument of his own permanent destruction. While Connor adjusted to his harsh new reality, the financial devastation he left in his wake completely annihilated his mother and sister. Linda and Caitlin had foolishly tied their entire existence to his fabricated success, and their fall from the ranks of Seattle high society was spectacularly brutal. The predatory lending agency that Linda used to fund Connor's sleazy defamation lawsuit did not care about her manufactured tears or her sob stories. When Connor's assets were permanently seized by the federal government, the lender aggressively called in her massive high-interest loan. Because she had foolishly used her entire retirement portfolio and her home equity as collateral, she was completely and thoroughly bankrupted within a matter of weeks. The foreclosure on her beautiful, sprawling suburban estate was fast and unforgiving. The same wealthy friends and elite country club members she used to brag to instantly cut all ties. In the incredibly ruthless circles of high society, associating with the newly destitute mother of a convicted, highly publicized federal fraudster is considered absolute social suicide. They stopped returning her frantic phone calls, ignored her desperate emails, and completely blocked her from their private events. Stripped of her wealth, her home, and her precious social standing, Linda was forced to pack whatever meager belongings the bank did not seize. She and Caitlin moved into a tiny, cramped, low-income apartment complex on the industrial outskirts of the city. Caitlin, who had spent her entire adult life acting like an entitled heiress, suddenly found herself staring down the terrifying reality of having to find a basic entry-level job just to help her mother keep the electricity running. The luxury vehicles, the designer handbags, and the arrogant sneers were all gone, replaced entirely by the crushing, exhausting burden of living paycheck to paycheck in absolute obscurity. Ashley's descent into ruin was just as complete, serving as a harsh testament to the dangers of pure, unadulterated greed. My former best friend thought she could outsmart the federal government by pinning the entire financial scheme on me. Instead, the heavily redacted files I handed over to the authorities proved she was the primary domestic architect of the money laundering operation. Faced with the terrifying prospect of joining Connor in federal prison for conspiracy and wire fraud, Ashley panicked. She accepted a devastating plea agreement that kept her out of a concrete cell but completely destroyed the rest of her life. As part of her strict sentencing, her highly lucrative real estate license was permanently and irrevocably revoked. She was officially barred from ever working in the financial or property sectors again. The judge also ordered her to pay a massive sum in legal restitution for her role in the corporate damages. With her professional reputation obliterated and her elite client list completely burned, Ashley had no way to generate her usual exorbitant income. The woman who once sat on my living room couch drinking expensive wine and plotting to steal my life was forced into a minimum wage retail job just to meet her monthly court-ordered payments. I occasionally saw brief glimpses of her miserable new reality when I checked the public court dockets. She traded her sleek luxury vehicles and expensive downtown condominium for a life of grueling, repetitive manual labor under the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of a massive discount department store. Her name became a cautionary tale whispered among the city real estate brokers, a lasting reminder of what happens when ambition crosses the line into absolute criminal betrayal. They had all banded together to maliciously destroy me, absolutely confident that they permanently held all the power. In the very end, their own toxic, enabling, and bottomless blinding arrogance cost them absolutely everything they ever truly valued. With the architects of my destruction securely locked away in their respective personal and legal prisons, I finally had the quiet, uninterrupted space to rebuild my own life. The actual legal process of dissolving my marriage turned out to be remarkably anticlimactic. Divorcing a man who is currently serving a decade in a high-security federal penitentiary does not require messy, drawn-out mediation sessions or bitter arguments over asset division. My divorce attorney filed the paperwork, and a family court judge eagerly granted the dissolution without a single objection. Connor did not even attempt to contest it. He was far too busy trying to secure protective custody to care about a civil family court docket. My pristine, fully paid-off suburban estate remained entirely in the name of my blind limited liability company, completely untouched by his massive financial ruin. I had legally severed myself from the dead weight I had been unknowingly dragging around for the last 5 years. While my personal life settled into a deeply comforting rhythm of peace, my professional life absolutely exploded. The dramatic, highly publicized events of the annual financial gala did not ruin my reputation as Connor had maliciously intended. Instead, the spectacle served as the ultimate undeniable proof of my absolute professional competence. I had not just talked about cybersecurity compliance, I had actively dismantled an international money laundering syndicate and protected the assets of my domestic clients in real time under extreme duress. The chief executive officers and hospital directors who had threatened to cancel my contracts immediately called my office the morning after the gala. They did not call to invoke their morality clauses. They called to offer profound, humbling apologies and to beg me to sign massive long-term contract extensions. The news of my flawless digital trap spread rapidly through the elite corporate networks of the West Coast. Within 3 months, my boutique data privacy firm transformed into the most intensely sought-after cybersecurity contractor in the entire state of Washington. I had to quickly lease a larger commercial office space downtown and hire a dozen new senior analysts just to handle the overwhelming influx of high-level corporate requests. My annual revenue did not just double, it more than tripled. The business Connor had constantly mocked as an overglorified help desk was now grossing more legitimate capital in a single quarter than his corrupt venture capital firm ever did. I poured that newly acquired wealth directly back into my own happiness. I did not buy flashy sports cars or take lavish, heavily photographed vacations to prove my worth to strangers on the internet. I simply invested in the quiet, absolute security of my own independence. I completely remodeled the home office where the federal agents had nearly arrested me, turning it into a beautiful, sunlit sanctuary dedicated entirely to my expanding corporate empire. I replaced the vintage leather sofas Linda had tried to steal with plush, comfortable furniture that I actually liked. Every single trace of Connor was methodically erased from the property. I donated his remaining expensive clothes to a local charity shelter, threw away his imported scotch, and purged his pretentious business books from my shelves. The house no longer felt like a shared marital asset or a battleground. It felt like a true home, radiating a warm, inviting energy that matched my internal healing. The profound sense of isolation I felt during the smear campaign slowly melted away. I began hosting quiet, intimate dinner parties for the loyal friends and dedicated colleagues who had stood by me when the public narrative was entirely against me. We drank good wine, cooked elaborate meals together, and laughed until our sides physically ached. I realized that the profound, suffocating loneliness I used to feel in my marriage was completely gone. I was no longer spending my evenings waiting for a husband who was secretly funneling stolen cash to his mistress. I was no longer biting my tongue to keep the peace with an entitled, deeply toxic family who viewed me as nothing more than a boring inconvenience. The heavy, invisible armor I had worn for 5 years was finally allowed to fall away. Exactly 1 year after the morning the federal agents kicked down my door, I woke up early to the gentle golden light of a perfect Pacific Northwest summer. I brewed a pot of rich, dark coffee and walked out onto the expansive wooden deck of my beautiful backyard. The air was crisp and incredibly fresh, carrying the faint, sweet scent of the blooming pine trees that lined my secure property. I sat down in a comfortable wicker chair, resting my bare feet on the warm wood, and simply listened to the quiet, peaceful morning. There were no aggressive process servers pounding on my door. There were no screaming, entitled in-laws demanding my possessions. There was only the gentle rustle of the wind through the high branches. As I took a slow, deep sip of my coffee, my cell phone buzzed softly on the small glass table next to me. I glanced down at the bright screen. It was an automated digital notification from the Federal Bureau of Prisons communication system. It was an incoming electronic message from Connor. The subject line preview displayed a desperate, weeping plea. He was begging me to put just a few dollars into his prison commissary account, claiming he was starving, terrified, and had absolutely no one else left in the world to ask for help. His mother was too broke to send cash, and his sister was completely ignoring his calls. He was reaching out to the very woman he had tried to destroy, hoping I still harbored some microscopic shred of spousal pity. I did not feel a sudden surge of anger. I did not feel the need to type out a scathing, victorious reply to remind him of exactly how he ended up in that concrete cell. I simply reached out and picked up the phone. Without reading a single word past the pathetic subject line, I pressed the delete button. I navigated to the automated prison communication portal and permanently blocked his inmate registration number from ever contacting my devices again. I set the phone face down on the table, leaned back in my chair, and turned my face up toward the bright rising sun. I smiled at the perfect unbroken silence of my backyard finally, and absolutely free. Looking back at the nightmare I survived, I realized that standing up for yourself does not have to mean lashing out in anger. Sometimes the most painful betrayals force us to find strength we never knew we had. Connor and his toxic family believed they held all the power because they thought my silence made me weak. But I learned a very hard lesson about trust and self-respect. Protect yourself with both documentation and boundaries. The people who truly love you will respect those boundaries, and the ones who do not were never safe for you to begin with. For 5 years, I let my in-laws make me feel like I was never enough for their golden child. I finally understand that your worth was never determined by their failure. Their limitations are not your destiny. You do not need your family approval to build a meaningful life. When they tried to destroy my career and steal my future, I did not seek blind vengeance. Revenge was not about cruelty, but about justice, about balance, about ensuring that consequences met actions. By walking away and securing my own absolute independence, I proved that sometimes the best revenge is not destruction, but simply becoming so successful, so happy, so free, that their opinions no longer matter. Families are defined not by biology or legal documents, but by the consistent choice to show up, to value, to prioritize one another. I chose to prioritize myself. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic people who tried to manipulate your life? I would love to hear your experiences in the comments below. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel for more stories about resilience and reclaiming your power.